Reasons for control, well, disease obviously being the main factor. And this is both rats and mice. And probably the key, and I've picked on three primary ones, but for you guys working in areas where rats will be, leptospirosis is a significant risk. So please always make sure that you wear your gloves whenever dealing with any rodent infestations, but particularly rats. The bigger issue is probably salmonella for you guys, where mice and rats will, or have the ability, I should say, to transmit and pass on salmonella. And going back to the late 80s, early 90s, when we had the big issue with salmonella, and particularly in poultry, very few people looked at mice back then. Now, what will happen is that the mice will get into the feed. They then lay droppings. Those droppings are then in the feed that are then presented to the birds. And if salmonella is within those droppings and the birds eat it, that is the route of exposure. So the need for mouse control is actually really important, particularly in feed and particularly in young birds where they're probably more susceptible. We're also finding toxoplasmosis, which was originally a feline parasite, predominantly on pregnant women, which is why women shouldn't be clearing out things like kitty litter if you have a domestic cat. We're now finding that mice are carrying them, and also the parasite has mutated and is increasingly having issues with male population as well. The damage they can do, so their teeth grow continuously, and that's where they gnaw. And we're finding a lot more farm fires are now occurring where rats and mice have chewed through exposed electric cables. Rodents are predominantly active at night when it's all nice and quiet. We're not around to easily go in and start firefighting. We then have food contamination. One of the areas, of course, that we have a big problem with is that we have to make food available. We then have to store it. And it's that stored food that can actually give rats and mice a really good opportunity. One, for food, but two, they then come in and contaminate. Animal welfare is obviously an important matter and one that's on the increase. And certainly with groups like AHDB, Lion Passport, and a few other groups, the subject matter now of how we look after our animals and making sure that they are in the best condition, well, of course, rodents would have an impact or a negative impact on that. And of course, we've got our lovely auditors that come into play, people who will come in from external organizations and check and make sure that you're doing everything that should be, that needs to be, in as much as they have a list of questions that they need to work through. Our job is to make sure that you are all in a position so that if an auditor comes in and asks a question, so we all know the answer. So to kind of summarize that, everyone thinks that rats are the bad ones out of this from a disease, from food loss contamination. Actually, mice are just as bad. But it tends to be that rats got the bad press. Think of all the cartoons, the sinister characters were rats. Whereas you think about mice, Tom and Jerry, it was a little more lighthearted about their approach. They are just as bad as each other in terms of the reasons for control.